Maggie Carter was 27 years old when a neighbor asked her to haul some dead equipment off a hillside nobody wanted. She almost said no. She had had a shop full of real work waiting on her, tractors with cracked manifolds, a hay rake that needed a whole new frame welded under it, customers who called twice a day wanting to know when their machines would be ready. But the neighbor, a man named Dale Whitfield, had known her father, and Maggie still had a hard time turning down anybody who'd known her father. Eastern Tennessee, early 1990s. Maggie had been running Carter Repair and Fabrication for a little over a year by then, ever since her father passed and left her the shop, the tools, and a reputation she wasn't sure she'd earned yet on her own. She wasn't an engineer. She hadn't gone to college for any of this. What she had was 12 years standing next to her father at that workbench, learning how to look at a broken part and figure out why it broke before she ever picked up a torch to fix it. Her father used to tell customers that most machines didn't fail because of one big thing. They failed because somebody ignored a small thing for a long time. Maggie had carried that idea into everything she did since taking over the shop, checking bolts twice, measuring twice, cutting once, the way he'd drilled into her since she was tall enough to reach the vise. She kept his old 6-inch steel machinist ruler in her breast pocket, out of habit more than anything, the same pocket he used to keep it in. It had his initials scratched into the side, worn soft with age. The 96-acre property Dale wanted cleared sat on a steep hillside a few miles outside town, the kind of ground the county had written off years earlier. Heavy rains stripped the topsoil off that slope faster than anybody could replace it. 3 different owners had tried to farm parts of it and given up. The current owner just wanted the old equipment gone so he could list the land and be done with it. Maggie drove out with her flatbed trailer and a rough idea of where the machinery was supposed to be: an old hay baler rusted solid, a broken disc harrow, a stock trailer with the axle long gone. While she walked the hillside looking for the equipment, she noticed something in the grass that had nothing to do with any of it. Faint depressions, running roughly parallel to each other, curving gently along the contour of the slope instead of running straight down it. She stopped walking. She'd spent enough years around drainage ditches, culverts, and grading work to know that erosion didn't usually organize itself that neatly. She pulled the ruler from her pocket and crouched down at the nearest depression, pressing it into the soil to check the depth. A little over 3 inches, fairly consistent from where she was kneeling to as far as she could see it curve off through the grass. She moved to the next line over and checked again, almost the same depth. Too regular to be random. She mentioned it to Dale later that afternoon, more out of curiosity than anything. He shrugged and said the county extension office had looked at the property years back and called the depressions remnants of old drainage ditches, dug sometime before anybody currently living out there could remember and long since obsolete. Maggie wasn't fully convinced, though she couldn't have said exactly why at the time. It was just a feeling, the same feeling she got sometimes standing over a machine that everybody else had already given up diagnosing. She went back out a few days later, after the equipment was hauled off, and Dale had already paid her for the job, just to look a little longer before the property changed hands and she lost her excuse to be there. She found an old equipment shed near the property line, half collapsed, full of the kind of junk that accumulates on a farm over 60 years. Tucked behind a stack of rotten fence posts, she found a rolled photograph, brittle at the edges, an aerial shot of the hillside dated 1937 in faded pencil on the back. The same curved lines ran across the slope in the photograph, sharper and more numerous than what remained in the grass today, clearly intentional, clearly built by somebody who knew exactly what they were doing. In a drawer nearby, she found an old farm notebook, water-stained, most of the writing faded past reading. One line near the front had survived better than the rest, written in a careful, old-fashioned hand. "Never send water downhill faster than the hill can drink it." Maggie read it twice. She didn't fully understand what it meant, not yet, but something about it stuck with her, the way her father's short, blunt shop sayings used to stick with her. She asked Dale if she could take a closer look at the hillside before it sold, maybe try to clean up a section of those old lines. Dale didn't much care what she did with it, so long as it didn't cost him anything, and told her to have at it. Maggie's first instinct came straight out of her drainage and fabrication background. Water needs somewhere to go. Standing water on a slope is a problem. The obvious fix to her was to restore one of the old contour lines and give it a proper outlet, a place for the water to exit quickly and cleanly instead of pooling or spreading unpredictably. She spent a weekend clearing brush and loose soil out of one long section of the old ditch line, cutting it back down close to its original depth, and then, at the low end of the run, she dug the outlet deeper and wider, the way she would have sized a drain on any piece of equipment or building lot. It felt like good, solid work. It looked clean when she finished. A little over a week later, a moderate rain came through. Nothing severe, just a normal spring storm. Maggie drove out afterward to check on her work, expecting to see the water had moved through the way she'd planned. Instead, she found a fresh gully cut straight down the hillside below her new outlet, several inches deep already. Raw dirt exposed where healthy grass had been standing just days before. Her restored section had done exactly what she designed it to do. It had collected water efficiently and released it in one concentrated place, and that concentrated release had torn straight through the soil below it, with more force than the hillside had ever seen from that spot before. She'd made things worse, not better. Maggie sat on the tailgate of her truck for a long while that afternoon, looking at the damage, running back through everything she'd measured and everything she'd assumed. She pulled the ruler out again, working her way down the new gully, checking depth at intervals, marking where the worst cutting had happened, and where the soil had simply washed away downstream. The pattern was obvious once she made herself look for it honestly. She hadn't restored an old system. She'd built a drain pipe out of it, and old farm ground apparently didn't want a drain pipe. She thought about the notebook line again. Never send water downhill faster than the hill can drink it. She'd done the opposite, and the hillside had shown her exactly what that cost. Maggie wasn't the kind of person who let a problem sit unsolved for long, but she also knew she'd hit the edge of what she actually understood. She started asking around, and eventually a retired county extension worker gave her the name of a man who used to work for the old Soil Conservation Service, a man named Walter Pruitt, long retired, living a few counties over. She drove out to see him on a Saturday, bringing the aerial photograph and the notebook with her. Walter looked at the photograph for a long time before saying much of anything. Then he told her what she was looking at wasn't drainage ditching at all, not in the sense Maggie had assumed. It was an old contour system, built decades earlier by farmers and conservation crews working together during a period when soil erosion was costing entire hillsides across the region. The shallow, curving lines weren't meant to move water off the hill quickly. They were built to slow it down, spread it out along the contour instead of letting it gather into a single channel, and give the ground time to absorb what it could before the rest moved gently along to the next line down. Grassed spillways, built at specific low points, handled the overflow when a storm was heavy enough that the lines alone couldn't hold everything. Sediment settled out along the way instead of washing straight downhill. Walter didn't hand her a blueprint. He walked her through the general shape of the idea, sketched a rough cross-section on a scrap of paper to show her how shallow the grade needed to be, and told her the exact numbers would depend on her particular hillside, numbers she'd have to work out herself by testing. These old boys didn't have machines to do this, Walter told her, tapping the photograph with one finger. They had eyes, a level, and a lot of patience, same as you're going to need. He asked her how deep her failed outlet had cut, and Maggie told him, pulling the numbers straight from her notes instead of guessing. Walter nodded slowly. That kind of cutting, he said, was exactly what happened when somebody gave water one door out instead of 100 small ones. The old systems worked because they never asked the hill to do anything it couldn't already handle a little at a time. Maggie went back to the property with a different plan entirely. Instead of restoring long stretches of ditch line with a hard outlet at the bottom, she picked a single short section near the top of the slope and rebuilt it the way Walter had described. A shallow, gently graded channel following the contour almost level, with only the faintest fall along its length, ending not in a dug outlet but in a wide, grassed area where any overflow could spread out instead of concentrating. She used stakes and string to hold the line while she worked, and built a crude water level out of a length of clear tubing and a bucket, the kind of improvised tool her father would have made in an afternoon without thinking twice about it. She checked slope with the ruler wherever the grade was too subtle to read by eye, laying it against short sections of string to gauge tiny changes in elevation inch by inch. After each rain, she walked the section and measured again. Where sediment had gathered, how much soil moisture the ground beneath the line was holding a day later, compared with untouched ground nearby, whether any new cutting had started anywhere along the run. She adjusted one thing at a time. A section that drained a little too fast, she flattened further. A spot where water pooled too long, she opened slightly. It was slow, careful work, nothing like the confident afternoon she'd spent digging that first failed outlet. Some evenings she drove home with nothing to show for the day but a page of numbers and a change of half an inch in one short stretch of channel. Other evenings she came back to the shop and built something small to make the next test easier. A longer story pole marked off with her father's ruler, a simple frame to hold string taut across uneven ground, little tools nobody would ever notice but her. Weeks passed this way, then months, Maggie extending the restoration only after a section had survived several rains without a new problem showing up. By late summer she'd rebuilt close to a third of the old contour lines across the upper part of the hillside, working outward from that first small test section in careful tested steps. Then, in early September, a major storm parked itself over the county for most of a night, dropping close to 6 inches of rain before it finally moved on. The next morning, Maggie drove out to check the hillside, half expecting to find more of what she'd caused with her own outlet months earlier. A newly graded hillside on the far side of the valley, cleared and shaped just that spring for a housing lot, had shed its rainfall so fast overnight that runoff tore across a stretch of county road below it, undercutting the shoulder and closing a lane until crews could get out and repair it. Maggie's hillside flooded too. She wasn't foolish enough to expect otherwise, not after everything Walter had told her. 6 inches of rain in one night was more than any hillside was going to fully absorb, contour lines or not. But walking the slope that morning, she found something very different from what she'd created with her own hands back in the spring. The restored sections had slowed the water down enough to spread it along the contour instead of letting it gather into a single tearing channel. The grassed overflow areas had done their job, carrying excess water gently downhill in a wide, shallow sheet instead of a concentrated cut. Sediment sat in visible bands along several of the lines, caught before it could wash all the way down the slope. There were no fresh gullies anywhere across the section she'd rebuilt, nothing like the raw wound she'd left below her outlet the previous spring. The untouched lower portion of the hillside, the part she hadn't gotten to yet, showed some of the same old erosion patterns the property had always had. Proof enough that the difference wasn't luck or a lighter storm hitting one side of the hill and not the other. It was proof the system itself was doing something real. Maggie walked the length of it twice that morning, checking the same spots she'd checked after every rain since spring, comparing what she found against pages and pages of notes going back to that first failed outlet. For the first time since she'd started, the numbers told her a clean story instead of a mixed one. The lines had held. Word of the flooded county road reached the local paper within a day or two, along with a mention that a nearby hillside restoration project had apparently come through the same storm without similar damage. The county's soil conservation officer, a careful, unhurried man named Everett Combs, drove out to see it for himself once he heard about it. He walked the slope slowly, crouching now and then to look closely at a section of grassed spillway or a band of settled sediment along one of the shallow lines. He didn't say much at first. Maggie walked with him, answering questions when he asked them, staying quiet the rest of the time, the way she'd learned to do standing next to her father, while a customer looked over finished work, before deciding whether they were satisfied. Near the top of the hillside, Everett stopped and looked back down the length of the restored contour, following the curve of it, with his eyes the same way Maggie had once followed the curve of an old photograph in a dusty equipment shed. "Do you still have that old photograph?" he asked. Maggie walked back to her truck, pulled a folder from behind the seat, and handed him a copy. "I made copies," she said. "Figured I'd need more than one before this was done." Everett studied it for a long moment, comparing the faded curves in the picture against the lines still cut into the hillside in front of him. He didn't offer any grand praise. He just nodded slowly, the way a man nods when a piece of old, half-forgotten knowledge suddenly makes sense again in front of him. Before he left, Everett asked one more question, almost as an afterthought. "You do this kind of work for hire, or was this just yours?" Maggie hadn't really thought about it that way. Word about the road damage on one side of the valley and the hillside that hadn't washed out on the other side had already started moving through the county the way news like that always did. One farmer mentioning it to another over a fence line or at the feed store. Within a couple of weeks, a man named Roy Hensley, who worked a 28-acre slope a few miles east that lost a little more topsoil every spring, called the shop and asked if Maggie would take a look. She walked his ground with the same notebook and the same ruler, working out where his worst cutting was happening and whether the slope even had a shot at holding a contour system the way hers had. She gave him a number before she started, the way her father always insisted she quote a job instead of guessing out loud afterward. Materials, mostly stakes, string, and grass seed, plus the rental on a small grading blade for a few days, came to a little under $600. Her own time she charged separately, a flat rate she'd worked out from what the job would likely take. Nowhere close to what an engineer might have billed for the same acreage, but enough to make the trip worth her while. Roy did the math out loud right there in his kitchen, comparing that number against what he'd already spent twice in the last 5 years, hauling in fresh topsoil and regrading a washed-out farm lane after bad spring storms. The restoration cost less than either one of those repairs by itself, and it wouldn't need repeating every few years the way the topsoil did. He told her to go ahead. That first paid job on Roy's place became 2 more by the following spring, a stretch of erosion-prone pasture for a widow named Ruth Ann Sellers, who'd heard about it from Roy at church, and a smaller section behind a hay barn for a young couple just starting out on land that used to belong to the husband's grandfather. None of it made Maggie rich. The fabrication shop stayed her main business, same as it had always been, tractors and brackets and welding jobs paying the real bills. But by the next fall, Carter Repair and Fabrication had a second, smaller sign hanging under the first one out by the road, hand-lettered, nothing fancy. Contour and Drainage Restoration, it read. Ask about the hillside. Maggie stood there with her father's ruler in her breast pocket, the same one she'd used to measure those first strange depressions in the grass almost a year earlier. The same one she'd used to trace the damage of her own mistake, and the same one still riding with her now, worn a little smoother from all the extra handling. Everyone had assumed the old lines on that hillside were a failed drainage system, dug by farmers who didn't know any better and abandoned once it stopped working. Maggie had assumed the same thing herself, right up until her own attempt to make the hill drain faster had torn it open in a way 60 years of neglect never had. The lines had never been built to get water off that hillside quickly. They'd been built to keep the hillside from losing itself, one slow, patient inch of rain at a time. Maggie folded the copy of the photograph and slid it back into the folder, tucked the ruler back into her pocket where it belonged, and looked out over ground that had finally started holding on to what it had left.